So I'm going to start off giving a short background to the NPHI of the National Institute for Communicable Diseases and how we handled the H1N1 pandemic in this country. I certainly wasn't appointed to this post because of my computer skills. So these are preliminary observations, and I really must stress that they are preliminary, as you'll see just now. Just a little bit of background of the surveillance systems which have been used in our country to define and describe the characteristics of H1N1 and the outbreak. Unfortunately and regrettably, and this is really where we do need to make up a large amount of leeway, there is a major gap in surveillance of influenza on the African continent. This diagram of Africa really represents where there are influenza laboratories. There are about a dozen influenza laboratories, but designated national influenza centers which have been WHO designated, there are only in fact about half a dozen covering the entire continent of 40-odd countries. So this is where we are at the moment. And our laboratory has done quite extensive training in the majority of the countries of what we call the SADC region, that's 14 countries in southern Africa, to try and build capacities in various countries. And various countries other than South Africa have got varying degrees of capabilities, and perhaps we can pick that up later on in discussion. So I'm going to focus on South Africa, and we've had a surveillance system for influenza, for seasonal influenza, going back right the way back to 1984. And at the moment it consists of, we call it a viral watch system, and there are a number of other countries around the world which also have very similar sentinel networks which pick up information regarding influenza. At the moment it's 243 sites in all of the 9 provinces of the country. Sites means either a general practitioner or a clinic that will provide clinical information as well as taking a nasopharyngeal swab in most cases, and that will go to the laboratory for characterization and then contribution to the design of the annual influenza vaccine composition. In this year, 2009, in response to the pandemic H1N1, this was augmented with an enhanced viral watch sites. These are an additional 10 sites in all of the 9 provinces, and these were hospital-based. The viral watch is a community-based sentinel network. So we augmented that with hospital-based surveillance. And in addition, there's a severe acute respiratory infection program, which is in these 3 provinces, in Gauteng, in Mpumalanga, and in KwaZulu-Natal. 4 hospitals are involved, which also provided both specimens as well as information. So that's the background of where the surveillance was cited in South Africa. The NPHI has also been involved in other activities other than surveillance for influenza. It has provided guidance in drawing, for example, the pandemic preparedness plan. As I mentioned earlier, this was really geared to H5N1, but a lot of the elements were also extrapolated into the present H1N1. And over the years, we've charted this is the viral watch system, we've charted the appearance of influenza and had the typical unimodal isolation of influenza, the various subtypes of influenza, and this goes all the way back to 1985. And just to illustrate that, being the southern hemisphere, of course, our influenza occurs from about late May to July, August. The median onset towards the latter part of May, week 23, the median peak towards the latter part of July, week 27, and the median duration 10 weeks. Nothing particularly unusual about that. The various subtypes which have been characterized in our laboratories, predominantly H3N2 over the years, to a significant extent also H1N1 also last year, seasonal H1N1 that is, and B more or less distributed throughout all the years. Again, very similar to many other countries. This year, 2009, we had a unique presentation of a bimodal curve, epidemic curve, because the pandemic was delayed. I'll come to that just now. So we had our initial seasonal outbreak with H3N2 influenza. That then came down and was replaced by pandemic H1N1. I should just mention this, of course, is a little bit artificially low because after the first 100 cases, we weren't sampling all cases because the laboratory was just simply overwhelmed. So this curve, of course, will be very, very much higher. Just out of insight, I should also apologize. The copy of the slide presentation in your binders is a little bit different to this. There's a bit of an error. What was sent through was a rather older version of this presentation. So you can just take that into account. So yes, the pandemic was delayed quite significantly in South Africa. As we know, it started in Mexico in early March, United States in April, and our pandemic in this country only started in the middle of June, quite a lot later than certainly than in the Northern Hemisphere. And it was delayed, we thought, predominantly due to the fact that the volume of traffic which could have imported the virus into the country, certainly for the African continent, is obviously very much lower than many other continents. And there's, in fact, very little traffic coming from Mexico. There's quite a lot from the United States, of course. But that probably delayed the onset of the introduction of the virus into South Africa. So this is what the epidemic looked like. It started the 13th of June when we got our first confirmed cases. And there was a lot of, in a way, pressure on our poor laboratory. We're not diagnosing it. Why is it not, everybody else has got it, and we weren't having it from May and to early June. And I think genuinely it really only started, in fact, in the middle of June. 13th of July, a month later, we had our first 100 cases. And I put that up because after the 13th of July, we weren't sampling all cases. We were then only focusing on specific either clinical presentations or clustering and so on. And then our first confirmed death was the 28th of July. And the full epidemic curve looks like this, peaking around in July and late August, and then going all the way. And in fact, the last couple of weeks, we haven't had any confirmed cases. So you're all quite safe here. I don't know about when you go back to your Northern Hemisphere countries, but at the moment we don't have. And this is where we looked more intensively at the first 100 cases. 42 of those 100 cases did have a travel history of onset of symptoms within the previous 7 days. And most of the importation was from the United States, 6 of the cases, United Kingdom, 5 cases, Australia, 5 cases. Again, I think reflecting, the volume of traffic coming into South Africa. And if you look at the incidence in the various provinces within South Africa, again, the highest incidence was in Gauteng province, where we are now, the incidence of 52.8.